In the world of knights and castles, there existed a far less romantic side of the Middle Ages, one of filth, pain, and thankless toil. While we often picture medieval life through the lens of nobility and chivalry, the truth for most people was anything but glamorous. In this episode of Dark Age Archives, we uncover the absolute worst jobs in medieval times. Occupations so dreadful, so revolting, and so dangerous, they make modern-day office work look like paradise. Let's begin with one of the most disgusting jobs of the era: the gong farmer. These poor souls worked mostly at night, crawling into cesspits beneath castles and towns to shovel out human waste by hand. With nothing but primitive tools and often no protective gear, they would heave tons of excrement into carts and haul it outside the city walls. The stench was unbearable, and the work was so foul that even touching a gong farmer could be seen as bad luck. And yet, their work was essential. Without them, medieval towns would have drowned in their own filth. Next, we have the executioner. While some may think of this as a position of power, the reality was very different. Executioners were social outcasts. Their job, carrying out hangings, beheadings, burnings, and floggings, meant they lived on the fringes of society. They were often denied sacraments, shunned in public, and sometimes even forced to wear masks or hide their identities. Some were born into the job. Others took it out of desperation. Either way, it was a grim and bloody existence. Then there were leech collectors. These workers waded into marshes and swamps, letting blood-sucking leeches attach to their skin so they could harvest them for medieval medical use. Doctors at the time believed in the theory of humors, so draining blood was seen as a cure for almost everything. That meant a high demand for leeches, and someone had to collect them. Over time, repeated bites led to infections, scarring, and even anemia. Another dreadful occupation: the tanner. Tanners transformed animal hides into leather, but the process was revolting. It involved soaking skins in a mixture of urine, lime, and animal dung to remove hair and flesh. The smell was horrendous, and the chemicals burned the skin. Tanneries were always located far from the rest of the town due to the overpowering odor. Workers often became sick or suffered chemical burns, and the profession was viewed as deeply dishonorable. Gravediggers had their own share of misery. During plagues like the Black Death, gravediggers worked day and night to bury thousands of bodies. They were at high risk of infection, suffered mental trauma from constant exposure to death, and were barely paid for their labor. Often, they were forced to bury people in mass graves, sometimes even while the victims were still faintly alive. Next comes the rat catcher. At a time when diseases like the plague ravaged cities, catching rats wasn't just a dirty job, it was a deadly one. These brave and often desperate individuals hunted rodents through sewers, alleys, and dark corners, sometimes with bare hands. A single bite could mean death. But with no proper pest control methods, they were society's best defense against vermin-borne illness. Also, among the worst jobs was the fuller's trade. Fullers cleaned and thickened woolen cloth by soaking it in stale urine and then trampling it barefoot in large vats. Yes, barefoot. The ammonia in urine helped cleanse the wool, but the smell and exposure to bacteria made it a revolting task. Like tanners, fullers were typically kept away from city centers, and their social status was among the lowest. Let's not forget coal miners. Early mining was done with picks and shovels, deep and narrow shafts with little ventilation. Explosions, collapses, and toxic gases were constant threats. Child labor was common, and many workers suffered from chronic lung diseases. Pay was poor, but many had no alternative. Finally, the plague doctor. While the image of a robed figure with a bird-like mask has become iconic, being a plague doctor was not a prestigious job. Most weren't even real doctors. They were volunteers or low-ranking physicians tasked with recording deaths and examining the sick. They wore thick leather garments and masks stuffed with herbs, but these offered little real protection. Many died within weeks of starting the job. These were the unsung laborers of the medieval world, the men and women who kept society running from the shadows. Their jobs were dirty, dangerous, and soul-crushing. But without them, the world of castles and cathedrals might never have thrived. So next time you complain about your job, remember the gong farmers, the leech collectors, and the grave diggers. Because in the grand scheme of history, your worst day at work probably doesn't involve wading through sewage or dancing in a vat of urine. Thank you for watching Dark Age Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and return for more deep dives into the brutal truths of medieval life. Let us delve even deeper into the harrowing reality of medieval labor. While the professions we've covered already were undeniably horrid, there were countless other roles that tested the limits of human endurance, hygiene, and morality. For instance, consider the life of a cesspit cleaner's assistant, a child or teenager who would accompany gong farmers into the deepest, darkest corners of waste systems. Their job was to climb down into holes too narrow for adults, scraping out the filth with wooden paddles. It was not uncommon for these children to faint or even drown in the sludge. Then there were lime burners. These men worked with quicklime, a substance so caustic it could strip skin from bone. Lime was essential for mortar, sanitation, and agriculture. But producing it involved standing over scorching kilns, inhaling toxic dust, and risking burns with every batch. Few lime burners lived long, and many suffered from chronic respiratory diseases. Medieval laundresses also had it rough. Far from the romantic image of a washerwoman by the riverbank, these women spent long hours scrubbing soiled linens by hand in icy waters, often while inhaling toxic smoke from heated vats. They dealt with clothing infested with lice, fleas, and even blood from wounds or childbirth. Their hands would crack and bleed from the cold and the lye-based soaps used for cleaning. Street cleaners and latrine diggers weren't much better off. In towns and cities where animals roamed freely and people dumped waste from their windows, someone had to clean the mess. These workers used shovels, brooms, and carts to remove animal carcasses, rotting food, vomit, and excrement. Disease was rampant, and protective gear was virtually non-existent. In the countryside, shepherds might seem to have had an idyllic job, but that was rarely the case. Many worked alone in the wild for months at a time, vulnerable to wolves, bandits, and freezing temperatures. They lived on meager rations and slept outdoors, tending flocks that could be wiped out overnight by disease or predators. Similarly grim were the fishmongers. While not all fishmongers suffered equally, those who worked inland dealt with rotting cargo that had been salted or dried for days. The smell was overwhelming, the risk of infection high, and their wares often infested with maggots. Customers were difficult to please, and spoiled fish could land them in jail, or worse. Then there were the chimney sweeps, boys often no older than 7, forced to crawl into narrow soot-choked flues. They risked falls, burns, and deadly lung diseases like chimney sweep's carcinoma. They received little pay and were usually orphans or children sold into servitude. Glassblowers and blacksmiths, though skilled artisans, worked in extremely hot conditions with molten materials. Eye injuries, burns, and toxic fume inhalation were constant threats. And while some blacksmiths earned modest respect, the physical toll was tremendous. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer, also faced hardships. They had to wake before dawn, carry heavy barrels, stir boiling vats, and ensure their brews didn't spoil. If they made bad ale, they could be publicly shamed or fined. Yet they were vital to medieval life, as beer was often safer to drink than water. And, of course, the salt miners. Salt was a precious commodity, but mining it involved descending into deep, claustrophobic tunnels filled with toxic air and falling rocks. The work eroded skin, destroyed lungs, and ended lives prematurely. Yet without salt, food preservation in the Middle Ages would have been impossible. These jobs highlight not only the immense suffering of individual workers, but also the social structures that kept them in place. Most of these roles were inherited, meaning children of tanners became tanners, and daughters of laundresses became laundresses. There was little opportunity for escape. These were lives of survival, not ambition. We tend to romanticize the past, but history is not just kings and knights. It is also the anonymous masses who toiled in muck and misery so that the rest of society could function. Their pain built cathedrals. Their sweat fed armies. Their suffering was the foundation upon which medieval civilization was built. So, the next time you feel frustrated with your boss or exhausted from work, remember that at least your job doesn't require handling urine-soaked wool or collecting leeches with your bare skin. The worst jobs in medieval times weren't just dirty, they were dehumanizing. Yet, remarkably, someone always stepped forward to do them. This has been Dark Age Archives. If you found this glimpse into medieval labor enlightening or horrifying, consider subscribing for more weekly explorations into the brutal, bizarre, and fascinating aspects of history. Let's take a moment to examine why these roles were necessary and why no social change eliminated them sooner. Medieval society was structured around rigid hierarchies and a scarcity of labor options. If you were born poor, illiterate, or into a specific family trade, you had little say in your future. The economy demanded certain dirty, dangerous jobs, and someone had to do them. In many towns, being a gong farmer, for instance, was a hereditary position. The son of a gong farmer often had no other path available. The job was stigmatized, but the need was so constant that authorities often paid them handsomely to ensure the waste was removed. In fact, some of the dirtiest jobs were paradoxically better paid than more respectable trades. Tanneries paid more than tailoring. Grave digging could earn more during plague years than carpentry. But money wasn't everything. Social rejection, health risks, and psychological trauma made these jobs some of the most miserable imaginable. The church often played a role in reinforcing these divides. Many jobs were seen as spiritually impure. Tanners and executioners, for example, were frequently barred from entering churches or receiving last rites. Even in death, their graves were placed at the edges of cemeteries. Yet society couldn't function without them. There's also the question of gender. Many of the dirtiest, most degrading tasks were done by women: laundresses, midwives, alewives, field workers. While their labor was essential, they were rarely paid equally or afforded the same legal protections. Female workers were often vulnerable to harassment, physical danger, and accusations of witchcraft, especially if they worked with the sick or dying. Consider midwives. While not a worse job in the physical sense, the emotional burden was heavy. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was incredibly dangerous. Many women and infants died. Midwives often served as the only support system, and when things went wrong, they were the first to be blamed, sometimes even accused of sorcery. Another job often overlooked: the itinerant peddler. These wandering merchants carried goods from village to village, often walking hundreds of kilometers with a heavy pack. They were subject to bandit attacks, exposure to the elements, and local suspicion. Many were denied lodging and had to sleep outdoors or in stables. And yet, they were crucial for connecting remote communities. And what about the bell ringers? During plague outbreaks, bell ringers walked the streets day and night, announcing deaths and carrying corpses to mass graves. They were exposed to infection constantly and often died without anyone even recording their names. We also mustn't forget those forced into work by punishment. Criminals were sometimes sentenced to labor instead of execution. They could be sent to work the mines, clean sewage, or serve as assistants to executioners. These jobs were done under guard, without pay, and with the constant threat of abuse. Ultimately, the worst jobs in medieval times remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite backbreaking work, disease, and public scorn, these individuals did what they had to survive. They deserve recognition, not just as footnotes in history, but as real people who lived, suffered, and endured. Thank you for exploring this darker chapter of medieval history with us. Subscribe to Dark Age Archives for more stories that reveal the raw, unfiltered truths of the past. Because history wasn't clean, fair, or kind, but it's worth remembering. Before we conclude, it's important to acknowledge the psychological toll these jobs took on the individuals who performed them. Chronic exposure to death, decay, and social isolation likely contributed to depression, anxiety, and other mental strains. Though these conditions had no formal diagnosis in the Middle Ages. Imagine the executioner who spends his days perfecting his blade, rehearsing the final words of the condemned, or watching entire crowds cheer for a public hanging. Or the tanner who never escapes the stench of dung and rot, not even in his dreams. Or the plague doctor walking from house to house, each knock on a door a potential death sentence for himself. The mental armor needed to endure such conditions must have been immense, or perhaps numbness set in. In some cases, workers in these jobs became hardened, cruel, or even deranged. Others turned to religion, alcohol, or superstition as coping mechanisms. Even children were not spared. Chimney sweeps, gong farmer apprentices, rat catchers, and street beggars often started as young as 6 or 7 years old. Their childhoods were consumed by filth and danger. There was no schooling, no play, and no hope of upward mobility. Meanwhile, those at the top of society rarely acknowledged the suffering below. Nobles bathed in rosewater while gong farmers wallowed in human waste. Royal courts held feasts while miners choked on coal dust. It was a world built on brutal inequity, and only the strongest or luckiest survived. And yet, these invisible workers formed the backbone of medieval life. They built the infrastructure, cleaned the streets, cared for the dying, buried the dead, processed the food, and protected the cities from disease. They deserve more than a passing mention in history. They deserve remembrance. So next time you walk through a museum filled with medieval tapestries, knights' armor, and glowing manuscripts, remember that the beauty of that era was paid for in blood, sweat, and sewage. This is Dark Age Archives. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the worst jobs of the medieval world. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We release new videos every few days uncovering the raw, brutal, and bizarre truths of our forgotten past. Until next time, stay curious and be glad you weren't born in the 14th century. Bonus fact: in some towns, gong farmers were required by law to wear specific colored clothing so others would avoid touching them. In a few rare cases, they even had their own separate entrances to inns or markets, if they were allowed entry at all. The stigma was that strong. Yet ironically, their earnings were sometimes double those of a skilled craftsman. Dirty work, it seems, came with hazard pay, even if it couldn't buy dignity. And with that, we close the lid, so to speak, on the worst jobs of medieval times.